All right. Welcome. I am Jane Boltz, Regional Coordinator of the Southwest region of the Jane Austen Society of North America, coming to you from Southern California in the LA region. Our presentation this morning is by Susannah Fullerton, who is presenting from Sydney, Australia, where the current time is 4:00 a.m. Sunday morning. So we thank her for this early morning talk. Susannah Fullerton is a citizen of the Commonwealth, born in Canada, raised in New Zealand, educated in Scotland, married to a South African, and now living in Australia. Susannah Fullerton has been president of the Jane Austen Society for nearly 30 years. She is the author of several books on Jane Austen and has spoken to Jane Austen groups in the US, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. She is a patron of the Kipling Society of Australia, a founding member of the New South Wales Dickens Society and of the Australian Bronte Association, and a member of the Dylan Thomas Society and Sherlock Holmes Society. Susannah is Sydney's best-known lecturer on classic novels. She leads popular literary tours in the UK, Europe, and US for Australians studying abroad, ASA. She also publishes a popular free monthly newsletter, Notes from a Book Addict. She received an Order of Australia medal for her services to literature and is a fellow of the Royal Society of New South Wales. Susannah's presentation this morning is on her book, Jane Austen and Crime, praised by Claire Tomlin as a central reading for every Janeite. We are welcome to honor Susannah Fullerton. Please unmute yourself and share your screen. Thank you, Susannah.
Hi, everybody. Just give me a moment to share my screen. There we are. Hopefully that is all fine. No, let me just go back there. Right, well, lovely to see so many people joining us today. I'm not quite sure what time of day it is for all of you. It's certainly early for me, but it's fabulous to meet so many of you via Zoom. And I do hope that you enjoy my talk on Jane Austen and crime, a rather unusual topic. Some people look at my book and think it's a crime novel, but it's not. It's a book analyzing the way in which Jane Austen uses crime within her fiction. So the book is available as a hardback. You can order it on my website and I can post you a signed copy, or you can get it on Kindle. So it's available in both ways, and I very much hope that you all enjoy it. I certainly had a lot of fun writing it. Came out now quite some years ago, but I think what I do is give people a slightly different angle on Jane Austen and look at how she dealt with crime in her fiction, what her contemporary readers would all have known about the different crimes that she discusses, and how she uses that all in her fiction. And of course, today we no longer have quite the understanding of crime in the Georgian era that all of her contemporaries would have had. So what I try to do is sort of fill in some of that. But let me give you some idea of that from my talk today. Now, I'd like to begin by reading you a letter from this volume, a collection of letters, which is, of course, one of the items of Jane Austen's fabulous juvenilia. And this is a letter written by a young lady, and it has this title: A letter from a young lady whose feelings, being too strong for her judgment, led her into the commission of errors which her heart disapproved. So that's the title of her story. And it's a very short little story. Many have been the cares and vicissitudes of my past life, my beloved Eleanor, and the only consolation I feel for their bitterness is that on a close examination of my conduct, I am convinced that I have strictly deserved them. I murdered my father at a very early period of my life. I have since murdered my mother, and I am now going to murder my sister. I have changed my religion so often that at present I have not an idea of any left. I have been a perjured witness in every public trial for these last 12 years, and I have forged my own will. In short, there is scarcely a crime that I have not committed. But I am now going to reform. Colonel Martin of the Horse Guards has paid his addresses to me, and we are to be married in a few days. As there is something singular in our courtship, I will give you an account of it. Colonel Martin is the second son of the late Sir John Martin, who died immensely rich, but bequeathing only £100,000 apiece to his three younger children, left the bulk of his fortune, about 8 million, to the present Sir Thomas. Upon his small pittance, the colonel lived tolerably contented for nearly 4 months, when he took it into his head to determine on getting the whole of his eldest brother's estate. A new will was forged, and the colonel produced it in court, but nobody would swear to its being the right will except himself, and he had sworn so much that nobody believed him. At that moment, I happened to be passing by the door of the court, and was beckoned in by the judge, who told the colonel that I was a lady ready to witness anything for the cause of justice, and advised him to apply to me. In short, the affair was soon adjusted. The colonel and I swore to its being the right will, and Sir Thomas has been obliged to resign all his ill-gotten wealth. The colonel, in gratitude, waited on me the next day with an offer of his hand. I am now going to murder my sister. Yours ever, Anna Parker. A rather fabulous letter from a young lady who seems to be committing every single crime she can possibly think of. And I think it shows that the young Jane Austen was very interested in the whole idea of crime. Now, I'd like to begin by telling you how I came to write a book on the subject of Jane Austen and crime. I was sitting on a bus one day travelling into the centre of Sydney, where I live, and I went past a rather wonderful old historic building called Darlinghurst Jail. And it came back into my mind that one relative of Jane Austen's, through marriage, not a blood relative, ended up being hanged in front of that jail for various crimes that he had committed. So I thought about him and I thought, oh, the only other connection that Jane Austen has with Australia is her aunt, Mrs. Lee Perrott, who might well have been sent out to this part of the world because of shoplifting. So I thought, well, her two tiny little connections with Australia are both concerned with crime. And as I sat there on the bus, I thought, well, I wonder what other crimes Jane Austen writes about. And if somebody does commit a crime in her novels or in her juvenilia, how do they get punished for it? And what were the punishments? You know, if a man like Mr. Bennet has his underage daughter, Lydia, eloping to Gretna Green, as they think it is, what could a father like Mr. Bennet do to punish the man eloping with his daughter? What happened to somebody caught poaching or gambling? Was adultery considered a crime in Jane Austen's day? And how does Mr. Rushworth deal with that in Mansfield Park? What did Jane Austen know of prisons and of people being hanged by the roadside in her day? She talks, of course, about highwaymen in Northanger Abbey. So how common were highwaymen and how did they get punished? So there were all these questions in my mind, and I thought to myself, well, maybe I could give a talk to the Jane Austen Society about some of the crimes in Jane Austen's fiction. Anyway, more thinking elapsed, and I went off to try and find some of the answers to my questions. And suddenly I realized that there was a book in this, that maybe I could actually write a whole book on the subject of Jane Austen and crime. And that, of course, is what I did. So this is the man that sort of got my thinking started. And his name was John Knatchbull. He was the half-brother of the man who married Jane Austen's favourite niece, Fanny. He was Sir Edward Knatchbull. He was a very respectable man, but unfortunately his family had this black sheep. And John Knatchbull was not a nice fellow. He ended up committing some financial crimes with forgery. And as a result of that, he was transported to Australia. So he came out to Sydney, but unfortunately, he did not learn from his first crimes. He did not reform and become a better person. He ended up splitting the head open of an elderly woman who lived in Sydney. And as a result of this very gruesome murder, it was decided that John Knatchbull's life needed to come to an end. He was to be hanged. So this is the building just a little bit along the road from where I live. And this is all after Jane Austen's death, of course. This is in the early 1840s. So John Knatchbull was hanged. This is an actual sketch that was done at the time of his hanging. So he'd have been brought out from the jail that you can see there in the background. He would have had to mount that scaffold, and there he was hanged by the neck until he was dead. Now, Sydney-siders regarded a hanging as a really good excuse to get together and have a bit of free entertainment. So an enormous crowd of about 10,000 people turned out to watch the hanging of John Knatchbull. And it was all reported in the papers, and afterwards you could buy, little broadsheets that told you all about the last moments of the condemned man, and it was all considered a very interesting entertainment for people in Sydney. Sir Edward Knatchbull back in England, of course, would have been horrified by the bad behaviour of his relative, and certainly his wife Fanny made no reference to this in letters. He was the black sheep, he'd gone to Australia, and they all just tried to put him out of their minds. So that was the little connection that I found there with Sydney and with Jane Austen's family. The other connection, of course, was her rather unliked aunt, Mrs. Jane Lee Perrott, a wealthy woman who was famously accused in the year 1799, so definitely within Jane Austen's lifetime, of stealing some lace from a shop in Bath. She left the shop with a parcel that was wrapped up, and as she left, the shop owner came running out after her and said, "Excuse me, madam, but I think you've got more lace in that parcel than you should have. You've got both black and white lace, and you only paid for one lot of lace." This was found to be the case. But there's a lot of doubt as to whether Mrs. Lee Perrott was actually guilty of shoplifting. Some people say she was later convicted or found to have stolen plants from a nursery, but we can't be certain if she had a bit of a kleptomaniac tendency or whether the shopkeeper was corrupt and had deliberately put the extra lace into the parcel with the hopes that Mrs. Lee Perrott would pay her money just to shut her up and keep the whole thing from becoming public knowledge. So at the time that Mrs. Lee Perrott was arrested, she had to go and live in the home of the jailer. She didn't live in the common prison. She was housed in the jailer's quarters, which was slightly better. Her husband moved in there with her to look after her. And there was very distinct possibility that were she to be found guilty, she would be transported to Australia. Now, her husband made plans that if that were the case, he would go with her. He would pay his own passage out there, and he would look after her once they got to Australia. And Mrs. Austen even wrote to the Lee Perrotts saying, "Well, if you would like my two daughters to come and join you in the prison, I'm very happy to send them." Fortunately for Jane and Cassandra, Mrs. Lee Perrott said, no, I wouldn't inflict that on your two daughters. They can stay at home. And I'm sure Jane and Cassandra were very relieved that they did not have to go and stay in the home of the jailer in Ilchester. But I think this event in the Austen family, and it must have been a very tumultuous time for all of them and very worrying indeed, because if the couple went to Australia, they would never see them again. So inevitably, this must have made Jane Austen think about crimes like shoplifting and punishments like transportation to Australia, and how, of course, all of this was dealt with by her society. So those are the two crimes that got me started on writing my book. Now, Jane Austen, I think, was very interested in crime. In her novel, Emma, she writes, "Wickedness is always wickedness." But how does one actually define wickedness in the Georgian era and throughout Jane Austen's lifetime? Well, there was certainly no doubt that murder was very high on the list of wickedness, and of course was seen as a terrible crime which would almost inevitably get the murderer hanged. And the Ratcliffe Highway murders took place in Jane Austen's lifetime, and this was in the year 1811. And they didn't know who had slaughtered this family in a very gruesome way. It was reported in various papers. Broadsheets were issued. People were really fascinated by these rather ghastly murders called the Ratcliffe Highway murders. So you can look them up online and find out more detail about them. But there's no doubt that people were being driven in Jane Austen's lifetime to more crimes. Crimes such as murder to get money from somebody, theft, of course, because there was so much poverty in her society that many people had to steal in order to survive. And the Georgians were very strict about some particular crimes, especially crimes against property. Property was sacrosanct, and they really didn't want people, damaging property or stealing property. So from the years 1765 through to 1785, so that covers the time when Jane Austen was born, there were 47 new acts brought into Parliament to protect the rights of common land, that dealt with poverty as a result of war. There were very bad harvests, so that, of course, led many people to steal because the harvests had failed and they had no money. There were banks going under. Many of you might remember that Jane Austen's brother Henry was involved in banking, and his bank collapsed just within a short time before Jane Austen's death. Population was also really growing in England. In the 1760s, so before Jane Austen was born, England had a population of 7 million people. But by 1815, so just a couple of years before she died, the population had climbed to 11 million. And many of those people, thanks to bad harvests and a poor life in the country, were moving into the cities, which were becoming much more crowded and, of course, much more dangerous. So it's inevitable, of course, that theft and murder and crimes against property would all become much more common during this time. Now, there was even murder in royal circles. One of the king's sons, he was involved, or his valet was involved in a murder, and there was even some suspicion that the Duke himself might have been the culprit. So there was murder in all sectors of society. This was reported in newspapers, and I think Jane Austen took an interest in some of these rather gruesome stories of the day. We certainly get a lot of murder in the juvenilia. It was the wonderful story I read you to start off my talk, where Anna Parker has murdered her father, her mother, and she's about to go off and murder her sister. She doesn't tell us how, but Jane Austen, of course, is sort of almost laughing at murder in her juvenilia. There's another character in Jack and Alice called Suki, and Suki is a rather violent young woman because we hear, for often has she threatened and sometimes endeavored to cut my throat. So this poor young woman has somebody endeavoring to cut her throat on a regular basis. So again, Jane Austen uses crime for humor in her juvenilia. But it's also interesting, thinking of murder, as to which of her characters actually almost wish to murder other people in the mature novels. Lady Susan is quite bad at this. She'll say, oh, I really hate somebody and I wish I could kill him. That's quite a frequent response that Lady Susan has to anyone that she doesn't like. Mary Crawford, she would like to kill off Tom Bertram so that Edmund, who she rather fancies, becomes the eldest brother. She's not keen on marrying a second son. So when Tom is sick, Mary makes a joke about bribing the physician to finish Tom off so that Edmund becomes the eldest son. William Price, we hear in Mansfield Park, is not very merciful to the first lieutenant. I think William would quite like to have the first lieutenant killed in battle so that a space opens up for his own promotion. And Mrs. Bennet quite often sort of wishes people out of the way as well. So does Sir Walter Elliot, interestingly, in Persuasion. If somebody is not a nice-looking man, he feels they need to be knocked on the head and removed from the world as quickly as possible. So there are some rather interesting wishes for the deaths of other people amongst Jane Austen's mature characters. Now, suicide was also considered a crime in Jane Austen's day. Today, of course, we just regard suicide as a tragic event for family and friends, and of course, for the person ending their own life. But in Jane Austen's day, suicide did actually have criminal ramifications. A human life was seen to belong, first of all, to God, and secondly, to the king. So if you took your own life, you were depriving God of one of his souls, and you were depriving the king of one of his subjects. So suicide was treated very harshly and with enormous disapproval. Now, this is a picture of a character called young Werther. Goethe published a novel in the year 1775, so the year of Jane Austen's birth, called The Sorrows of Young Werther, where a young man in Germany falls madly in love with a girl called Charlotte. Charlotte isn't interested in him, and in the end, he takes his own life. He blows his brains out while wearing yellow pantaloons and a blue jacket. Now, this book was phenomenally popular around Europe, was translated, of course, into English. Jane Austen certainly knew The Sorrows of Young Werther. And the book was so fashionable that it actually resulted in some copycat suicides. And Goethe was very upset that his book had had this response. So young men, unhappy in love, would dress themselves in blue coats and yellow pantaloons, and with a copy of the novel lying somewhere nearby, they would end their own lives. And this is something that psychologists actually talk of as being the Werther effect. So there's no doubt that it did sort of make suicide a romantically fashionable thing to do if your love affair was not going right. Now, how does Jane Austen use suicide? Well, again, she has it in her juvenilia. We have a young lady who flings herself into the river when her love affair doesn't go right and she is drowned. But I think we also get it in very interesting ways in Sense and Sensibility. When Marianne's love affair with Willoughby is going so unhappily, she goes wandering around in the wet grass when she goes to the home of the Palmers. She refuses to eat properly and look after herself. And of course, eventually she becomes dangerously ill. So later on, when Marianne recovers, she is aware that she really has almost been the cause of herself losing her own life. She says to her sister Eleanor, "Had I died, it would have been self-destruction." And self-destruction is just another way of saying suicide. And she feels that as a result of that, she needs to atone to her God and also to her family. So I think Marianne comes very, very close to a suicidal death in Sense and Sensibility. Now, there were consequences for suicides. They were not buried in consecrated ground. They were very frequently buried outside of a churchyard, and sometimes they were even buried in the common highway with a stake put through their hearts to sort of tether the restless souls that might try to wander after death. The other problem with a suicide is that the financial property of somebody committing suicide was handed over to the state, not to the family. This meant that many suicides were hushed up. The family would say, "Oh no, he died suddenly of a bad fever," or "he had an accident with his pistol," because of course they did not want to lose the whole of the person's estate to the king and the government. They wanted to keep it for themselves. So we do hear of suicidal impulses in some of the characters, but I think really it's with Marianne that Jane Austen investigates that crime, and it certainly was regarded as a crime of suicide within her fiction. Now, theft, of course, I've already briefly mentioned Mrs. Jane Lee Perrott's theft from the millinery shop in Bath. If she stole it or whether she was innocent or guilty, I guess we will never really know. But she was tried. There you can see a notice about the trial. So it was quite big publicity, and the Austen family must have felt really embarrassed that all this was going on within their very close family. This is the sister-in-law to Mrs. Austen. So it was all a very difficult and very long drawn out time. But a very large trial was held and Mrs. Lee Perrott was acquitted. She was able to go home with her husband instead of having to travel to Australia. So she was a very fortunate woman that she was not sent out to New South Wales, which at that time for convicts was not a very comfortable place to be living. Now, we also, of course, know about highwaymen. Catherine Morland making her sort of first excursion away from home in Northanger Abbey imagines highwaymen robbing the carriage. She thinks it all sounds very glamorous and exciting. But highwaymen was actually having, highway robbery was very common indeed in Jane Austen's time. In Sense and Sensibility, Sir John Middleton talks of holding an event when it's full moon. And many people planned their different evening events when it was full moon because it was better lighting on the roads, it was safer. And of course, there was slightly less danger of highwaymen if you were, not traveling in very dark places late at night. The Prime Minister got held up by highwaymen. So did the Prince of Wales, the Lord Mayor of London. And when General Tilney travels to Northanger Abbey, we hear that he travels with, quote, numerous outriders. So the outriders would all have been armed with pistols, and they would make sure that the general and his family were all safe from highwaymen. We hear that travellers often took a brace of blunderbusses with them when they went travelling. And Walpole commented that one was forced to travel at noon as if one was going into battle. So you needed plenty of weaponry when you were setting out on the roads. And it was quite common for parties of travellers to sort of gather somewhere together if they were all making the same journey and travel in convoy because there was safety in numbers from highwaymen who might relieve you of your pocket watch, your jewellery, and if you were very unfortunate, even your life. So Catherine thinks they sound very glamorous. There she is imagining highwaymen holding up the carriage and maybe even abducting her. But of course, that never happens. She does travel safely throughout her various journeys in Northanger Abbey. And highwaymen, when they were caught, were often hanged by the side of the road, and their bodies were left there in iron cages so they couldn't be removed. But birds would peck at them and the body would gradually rot. But they were considered to be a very good warning, hanging there at the side of the road from some tree or post as a warning to other people who might be thinking of highway robbery. So Jane Austen was certainly very aware of highwaymen in her society. We do hear of other thefts in Jane Austen's novels. There's the theft of the poultry at the ending of Emma, which quite brilliantly, I think, allows Mr. Woodhouse to accept that his daughter and Mr. Knightley should get married and Mr. Knightley should move into Hartfield. We hear of household security, doors being locked. Mrs. Norris talks about locking up the spare room within her house. Quite what Mrs. Norris keeps in there, I don't know, but she's very determined that nobody's going to pinch any of her possessions. There's lots of theft in the juvenilia. People are purloining banknotes at quite a rate in the juvenile stories. But it's also interesting to think that if you stole an item that was over a particular value and it wasn't very high at all, then this could be a hanging offence. So there are actually moments in Jane Austen's writing when characters do commit hanging offences with theft. Some of those are in the juvenilia, banknotes and other things. But interestingly, I think Mrs. Norris does commits such a theft. helps herself to all of the green baize that's going to be used for lovers' vows. And she whisks it home. Now, she has not paid for that green baize. Sir Thomas's finances have paid for it. And Mrs. Norris just purloins it and takes it home. And the value of that green baize would have been enough to get Mrs. Norris hanged had she been caught for that theft and tried and found guilty. So it's interesting to think, who are the thieves in Jane Austen? And of course, we get that amazing second chapter of Sense and Sensibility when horrible Fanny and John Dashwood cut down the amount promised to his sisters to a basket of fish and game when they are in season. And that's a marvelous piece of almost daylight robbery there, right at the start of Sense and Sensibility. So I think it's very interesting to look in the novels and examine the different moments when characters are helping themselves to things that do not belong, items that do not belong to them. And it tells us a lot about Jane Austen's characters. But when you think of how much value some of them are stealing and what the terrible consequences were for theft in the Georgian era, I think it does put those little thefts into a more serious context within the novels. Now, I also have a look at adultery. I've got a chapter in my book on adultery. This fascinating woman, Mary Ann Clark, became the mistress of one of the king's sons, the Duke of York, Prince Frederick, and she ended up selling various commissions in the army because the Duke was commander-in-chief of the army. And when she had the Duke at a tender moment in bed, she would say, "Why don't you just give so-and-so a promotion?" And Mary Ann Clark was being paid a lot of money for asking the Duke to arrange these various army promotions. So in the cartoon, you can see right above the bed, she's got a list of all the names of men she wants to get promoted. And she's persuading the Duke that, really he ought to do as she's asking and give these men promotions within the army. Now, he was a married man, so he is committing adultery with Mary Ann Clark, who, interestingly, was the ancestress of a very amazing writer called Daphne du Maurier. Daphne du Maurier ended up writing a biography. I think she was her great-grandmother. It might have been two greats, I've forgotten. So she's written a book called Mary Ann, all about this woman's amazing career. Eventually, the royal family paid Mary Ann to go off to France and spend the rest of her life there because she'd become such an embarrassment to the royal family with all this selling of commissions in the army. It became quite a public scandal. But the adultery, of course, was there very, very strongly in royal circles. All those royal brothers had many different mistresses, children by their mistresses. They got involved in the odd trial for adultery. So adultery was there amongst the highest of the land. And Jane Austen would certainly have been aware of the many mistresses of George, the future King George IV. And she was highly aware of adultery within her society. Now, so they're amongst the royals, as I mentioned. But what happened with adultery was if a man found that his wife had been having an affair with another man, he could take that man to court in what was called a criminal conversation trial, because that man had had a criminal conversation, i.e. adultery, with his wife. This was always shortened to a crim con. And the crim con trials were reported in great lurid detail in the papers, and people were fascinated by reading all about the adultery. And quite often, a husband could be paid quite large financial damages because his wife had slept with another man. Of course, a man in those days regarded a wife as his legal property, and had her body been used by another man, that was damaging his property, and of course could also result in a child that was not his. So crim con trials were big business in Jane Austen's time, and they were reported in the papers. So it was really all a question of property rather than of love. And we hear at the end of Mansfield Park that Mr. Rushworth is able to get a divorce from his wife, Maria. And almost certainly a crim con trial would have had to go on for him to get his divorce. So that, is something that Jane Austen's contemporary readers would have been very aware of. Jane Austen herself once boasted that she had a good eye at an adulteress. When she was going to a ball, there was a woman there that they knew was committing adultery, but Jane Austen is able to pick out the right woman, and she rather prided herself on having a good eye at spotting an adulteress at a ball. So the damages from crim con cases could be enormous. A man could sometimes be paid as much as £20,000 in damages for another man sleeping with his wife. And there's some interesting little stories that I tell in my book. One man said that after the crim con trial, he always referred to his wife as dear Mrs. So-and-so, because she had, this is the man that she went on to marry, because he had to pay so much in a crim con trial as a result of their adultery. It did also result in some difficult situations where elderly husbands who were a little bit short of cash would almost deliberately set traps for younger wives to have affairs with handsome younger men. And then they could take those men to court, they could have a crim con trial, and they could make a nice sum of money. So that was certainly one little way of some men dealing with crim con trials. Mansfield Park, I think, is of course the novel that most deals with adultery, because Maria Rushworth, as she has become, has an adulterous affair with Henry Crawford. And Jane Austen handles it all so wonderfully. Those scenes at Southerton with the locked gate, symbolism of the locked gate and squeezing around the edge of it, the ha-ha, the ditch into which Maria could fall, the symbolism of her gown maybe being torn as she squeezes around the edge, which of course the ripping of the gown is a symbol for the ripping of her reputation that will come. The symbolism in that Southerton scene is brilliantly handled by Jane Austen. And of course, it's all connected with the adulterous passion that she develops for Henry Crawford. So adultery is also in the juvenilia, but again, there Jane Austen tends to treat it in a comic way. But in Mansfield Park, she handles it very seriously and very symbolically indeed. So it's rather fascinating to look at adultery. Of course, it's there in Lady Susan as well. Lady Susan is, obviously not been faithful to her first husband, and I doubt she will ever be faithful to any husband in the future. So it's really interesting to see what Jane Austen does with adultery within her fiction. So it was a fun chapter to write in my book. So let's have a look now at elopements in Jane Austen's fiction. And of course, Lydia Bennet famously elopes with Mr. Wickham in Pride and Prejudice, and Julia Bertram elopes with Mr. Yates in Mansfield Park. Now, Lydia never makes it to Gretna Green, which was the place for eloping couples to get married at. But Julia does. We hear that she does make it to Scotland with Mr. Yates. They get married. Then they come back to Mansfield Park and sort of have to ask for forgiveness. But Lydia never shows any shame about her elopement. She's happy to just, eventually get married to Wickham, but she seems to feel no shame whatsoever about what she has done and the upset that she has caused her family. So in 1783, an act of Parliament made it illegal for young couples under the age of 21 to marry without parental consent. So this is what resulted in so many couples heading up to Gretna Green, just over the border into Scotland, because Scotland had very different marriage laws. And all a couple needed to do was to stand in front of a witness, and this didn't even need to be a man of the church, and say, I, Susannah, marry you, John, and basically the marriage was then formalized. So that's why so many couples headed to Scotland when they wanted to marry without parental permission. And marriages there were very quick and very cheap and easy. One of the very first buildings across the border was the blacksmith's forge. And the blacksmith decided that he would make a little bit of extra money by conducting marriages. And you can still visit that forge today, which still holds marriages. It's evidently a very popular venue for weddings. And so couples can get married still at Gretna Green. But it was a place that the very name of Gretna Green filled the hearts of respectable parents with great dread, because if your daughter left for Scotland, really her reputation was in tatters. And sometimes they would remarry according to English law when they got back to England. Sometimes fathers like Mr. Bennet went off in pursuit, trying to stop the eloping couple and bring the daughter safely back home. But it was all very scandalous and very upsetting. And while Mr. Bennet could argue in a court that Wickham is eloping with an underage daughter of his and is therefore sort of stealing Mr. Bennet's property away, of course, that would really only compound the shame of the elopement and upset everybody even more. So most parents tended to say, well, it's happened, it's very unfortunate, but I don't think there's really very much that we can do about it. So there, of course, is Lydia with Mr. Wickham, showing no shame whatsoever that she's enjoying staying in the same bed with him when she is not yet a married woman. And of course, it's Mr. Darcy who finally, pays some debts and arranges that Wickham will do the right thing by Lydia and do something to retrieve her shattered reputation. Things did eventually change. In 1856, an act made Gretna weddings valid only if they were preceded by a 3-week residence in Scotland. And couples like Wickham and Lydia, or Julia and Mr. Yates, did not really have the money to live in Scotland for 3 weeks before they could get married. So the desire to flee up north to the border all stopped as a result of that changing at the Parliament. So the threat of elopement is there, of course, and particularly in Pride and Prejudice and in Mansfield Park with Julia's elopement with Mr. Yates, something that Sir Thomas, a very respectable, upright man, finds absolutely horrifying. Now, prostitution was also considered a crime in Jane Austen's day, although very little was done to stamp this out. And of course, London in particular was full of prostitutes. So young men of the town like Henry Crawford or Wickham or Willoughby would have had no trouble whatsoever finding loose women that they could pay in order to have sex with them. In 1797, so during Jane Austen's lifetime, it was estimated that 10% of the female population of London worked in the area of prostitution. It was, of course, one of the very few ways that women could earn money. And so women, thrust out of homes or, having financial problems would often end up in prostitution because there were so few other choices available to them. Now, there was this rather interesting book available to young men like Wickham and Willoughby, Harris's List of Covent Garden Ladies. And this was regularly updated so men could buy a little copy. And this would basically tell them where they could go to find prostitutes, especially the specialities of the different prostitutes. So if they wanted somebody who wielded a whip, or they wanted somebody who dressed as a governess, or whatever the peculiar taste might be, that was all advertised in this little booklet, and men could go out and buy it, and they would know where to find these loose ladies. So we can hear of one young lady that she wielded a birchen rod with dexterity. So if that's your particular taste, then you know where to find her. Now, prostitution as such was not considered a crime. You could, have sex with a man and receive some money for it. What was a crime was to solicit a man or to live off immoral earnings. Or to run a house of ill fortune. So all of those things were, according to the laws of the day, considered crimes. So you were allowed to be paid by a man who wants to have sex with you, but you're not allowed to live off the money that he pays you, and you're not allowed to solicit him in the street. So really the whole area of prostitution in the criminal records of the time was a bit of a mess. And really the authorities just turned a blind eye. They realized they were never going to stamp this out. And so, everyone just lived with it. And probably many of the magistrates went off to see prostitutes themselves when it suited them. So there was occasionally an attempt to make an example of a prostitute. Sometimes there was public flogging of prostitutes in the streets, or they were put into the pillory, where people could mock them and throw rotten fruit at them and do whatever they liked. So I think Jane Austen is aware that women could so easily fall in society. This is one of Hogarth's famous prints. An innocent young woman is arriving from the country. She is being kindly treated by an older woman. And of course, that older woman is going to get her into the brothel, and her life will be a pretty miserable one from that time on. Hogarth fills the picture with symbolism. There's a dead goose in the background there. There's a pile of pails falling over to symbolize the young woman's fall. There's some lecherous looking men, including a clergyman, waiting there in the background. So it's a very interesting print, and he follows it up with others showing the poor young woman's fall from her virtuous background to becoming a prostitute in London streets. Now, in Sense and Sensibility, we hear about Eliza Brandon, the first love of Colonel Brandon. And she ends up in what's called a sponging house, so a debtor's house. She moves on from one man to another. So Eliza Brandon definitely falls into prostitution in that little sort of backstory that we hear in Sense and Sensibility. So Jane Austen was aware of this and how easily a respectable, virtuous woman could fall in society. And Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice recommends to Mr. Bennet that he turf his daughter out and, never see her again. Well, had Wickham not married her, Lydia too might well have become a prostitute in the streets of London in order to survive. So it's a crime that I think is there, sort of hovering on the edges of some of the stories that we get in Jane Austen's novels. Now, if you did have an affair with a man, it could frequently result in a bastard child because there was no contraception in Jane Austen's day, nothing to stop those babies from coming. And this is the Foundling Hospital in London, where many a bastard baby was left to be taken in, reared, taught useful skills, and eventually sent out to some sort of job. Many of the poor mothers leaving their babies there would leave a token, some sort of little token. It could be something that had been sewn, it could be, something printed, and they would keep half of it, and the other half would go with the baby. So that if ever their financial circumstances improved and they thought they might be able to come back and retrieve their baby by producing the token, they could identify which baby was there, which child was theirs. Not all of this building survives today, only a part of it. It's in Bloomsbury in London, and it's an excellent museum that I can really recommend visiting next time you're in that wonderful city. So mothers who gave birth to bastard children were expected to divulge the name of the father if they knew the name of the father. And excuse me. And it was actually considered a crime to give birth to a bastard child until the year 1787. So when Jane Austen was a little girl, it was considered criminal to give birth to an illegitimate baby. Not that there was much that could be done to stop the baby arriving, and prosecuting the poor mother afterwards was something that proved very difficult. But it was there on the statute books that it was a crime to give birth to an illegitimate baby. And we do have an illegitimate child in Emma with Harriet Smith, who is the child of some respectable man. We find out at the end of the book. We don't know about Harriet's mother, but at least her father is giving her shelter or arranging to have her at Mrs. Goddard's school. So she's receiving an education. She's actually far luckier than most of the bastard children of Jane Austen's England. And Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey hopes rather wishfully that a foundling might be left on the doorstep somewhere in her village of Fullerton. No foundling is left there, but she's clearly thinking of novels like Fielding's Tom Jones, when Tom Jones, of course, who's also illegitimate, is left on a doorstep in that novel and becomes a very attractive hero in the book. So Catherine rather longs for a foundling child to be left somewhere near her to add a bit of spice and interest to her life. Now, duels are something else that I think Jane Austen handles very cleverly within her fiction, and dueling was a crime. It became a crime during the time of King George III. So for two men to meet for a duel and possibly one kill another or get injure another was considered criminal. However, not everybody disapproved of dueling. Even a great moralist like Dr. Samuel Johnson felt that there was a place for dueling, and so some people felt that it really was a perfectly respectable activity and a good way of sorting out a quarrel. So what we hear, of course, in Jane Austen when it comes to dueling is that Mrs. Bennet, when her husband goes off to London to try and find Wickham, is terrified that Mr. Bennet will fight Mr. Wickham in a duel and he might be killed and they will be turfed out of their home and Mr. Collins will move in. I don't think Mrs. Bennet knows her husband very well after more than 20 years of marriage, because Mr. Bennet is almost the last person in Jane Austen who is likely to issue a challenge for a duel. So Jane Austen there uses dueling for comic purposes. But it was still a common activity in her lifetime, and she reflects this in Sense and Sensibility, when Colonel Brandon meets Willoughby for a duel. And this duel is handled in a very interesting way in that novel. It's passed over. In fact, many readers miss it altogether. Colonel Brandon tells Eleanor, "We met by appointment." He plans to, punish Willoughby for what he did to Eliza, Colonel Brandon's young ward, who's another bastard child, of course, within the novels. And we hear also that neither of them gets injured, and so no word of the affair gets abroad. Now, another novelist, not Jane Austen, might have made a huge thing of the duel. You might have had descriptions of pistols at dawn and the doctor waiting nearby in case somebody was injured. All the detail of people being nervous and trying to work things out at the very last minute and then stepping backwards, turning and firing with pistols or dueling with swords. But Jane Austen passes it over in just a few lines. And it's really interesting to note that Colonel Brandon, one of her most upright, moral characters, is the one that's engaging in an illegal activity within the novel. So he feels that dueling is fine. Eleanor sighs over it. She doesn't like the idea of a duel, but to an officer and a gentleman, she doesn't dare sort of reprimand him or say anything against dueling. So I tell you in my book what happens in a duel, the sorts of weapons that get considered, the formalities of a duel, which were all very important, and also some of the many duels that took place in Jane Austen's lifetime, including the Prime Minister. He was actually involved in a duel. So this is a contemporary cartoon So dueling was still very common indeed. And it was amongst members of the military that it proved hardest to stamp out, even though there were these various rules against dueling. That's why men went out early in the morning to rather lonely places like Hampstead Heath to conduct their duels because they didn't want the authorities to find out about them. So stamping it out amongst members of the military was really difficult. So by making her military character, Colonel Brandon, be the one to be involved in a duel, Jane Austen is reflecting again very accurately the status of dueling in her society and the fact that military men felt it was necessary. It was a form of safeguarding one's personal honor by fighting a duel. The Georgian era was known as the age of politeness for quite good reason, because if you offended somebody easily, they could challenge you to a duel and you could be badly injured or even killed. In 1810, an anti-dueling society was set up, and it didn't sort of manage to achieve all that much. Dueling would continue for a bit longer, usually with pistols in Jane Austen's day. Swords had started to go out of fashion, and Colonel Brandon and Willoughby almost definitely used pistols in their duel, and maybe Colonel Brandon fired in the air because one assumes as a military man he should be a good shot, and we hear that Willoughby is a good shot. Sir John Middleton praises his hunting skills. So it's interesting that the two men involved in that duel in Jane Austen's fiction both return uninjured as a result. There's a rather wonderful story of a tavern owner. He had a tavern just near to Hampstead Heath, and he advertised as part of the facilities of his establishment, because it was a very popular spot for dueling, pistols for two, champagne for one. So he's sort of assuming that one person is going to be celebrating after the duel, and he offers that as a sort of package deal at his establishment. So I think Jane Austen handles duels in a very interesting way within her fiction. She also mentions poaching in interesting ways too. And we hear in Mansfield Park, Mr. Rushworth boasts to his fiancée, Maria Bertram, of his, quote, zeal after poachers. So Mr. Rushworth is really keen to catch poachers on his estate. Now, there have been a lot of changes to laws about common land and who was allowed to catch what in the way of game on different lands. And many landlords, and probably Mr. Rushworth is one of them, set man traps to capture poachers on their estates. And these were very vicious pieces of equipment that could half remove a man's leg, certainly cause him injury for a very long time. And man traps get mentioned in Jane Austen's Juvenilia, where a heroine actually gets her leg caught in a man trap. She doesn't suffer all that much damage, and the leg is broken, but one of the other characters sets it and she goes hopping off quite happily after that. So Jane Austen does use it comically there. But I think in boasting that Mr. Rushworth is so keen to catch poachers tells us a lot about his character. It also tells us that he's completely wrong for Maria Bertram, because he's so stupid as a character. He's busy worrying about the men coming onto his estate to kill the odd pheasant or grouse. What he should be worrying about is Henry Crawford trying to take his wife, a different form of bird that belongs to Mr. Rushworth. So really, the stupid man is so short-sighted, he's not looking in the right direction when it comes to poaching. And there's a lot of interesting language about that Henry Crawford uses with Fanny Price. He says, I must make a little hole in Fanny Price's heart, as if she's a game bird that he needs to shoot. So the language of hunting and women comes into Mansfield Park quite strongly, and the idea of poaching a woman or a bird that does not belong to you is a rather interesting theme through the book. There were very muddled game laws at the time. Some men had the right to hunt and kill birds, others did not. It was all a bit confusing. But I think Jane Austen makes really interesting references with the tiny poaching reference there in Mansfield Park. So again, it's a symbolic reference that she handles very cleverly indeed. I look in my book at what I call social crimes, and one of those crimes was smuggling. Now, it was a crime. You were not allowed to bring tea or lace or brandy into Britain without paying duty on it. And smugglers were bringing it in and avoiding the duty. But many people just really turned a blind eye to smugglers and didn't fuss too much about people smuggling. In fact, Parson Woodford, so a very respectable Georgian minister of the church, dealt regularly with his local smugglers when he wanted a supply of brandy or rum or whatever it was. So many people didn't really regard smuggling with any great ferocity. But Jane Austen's brother was involved for a little while in sort of Coast Guard defence and keeping an eye out for smugglers. And Jane Austen almost certainly, at some time in her life, drank smuggled tea, because it's estimated that about half of the tea drunk in England during her lifetime was illegally obtained. So it came into Britain without the tax being paid. So there you can see Parson Woodford with his wonderful diary, well worth reading if you've never read it. And as I say, he talks quite openly in his diary about, saw my smuggler, left some money for him, and the next day, found my supply of brandy on the back doorstep. So when people like a respectable minister of the church are turning a blind eye to smuggling, it shows you that people really had very relaxed views indeed about smuggling. And another social crime was gaming, or gambling, as we would call it today. This was something that, again, happens with Mr. Wickham. We hear that he contracts gambling debts in Pride and Prejudice. And of course, Tom Bertram is also running up big debts in Mansfield Park. So gambling was also a crime. Anything over £10 was considered illegal. So if you were gambling for a sum bigger than that, you were committing a crime. But once again, society tended to turn something of a blind eye to the gambling that went on. And gambling took place in taverns and coffee houses and gentlemen's clubs and many other different places. So it's, I think, a very interesting another crime that's there in Jane Austen's fiction, which again she reflects with some of her less worthy characters within the novels. This is Charles Fox, who of course was a statesman of the day, and he had enormous gambling debts. His father had to pay off £40,000 in gaming debts before Charles James Fox turned 25. So men were squandering vast sums of money around the gambling tables in Jane Austen's England. Gothic crime, of course, is something that comes into Northanger Abbey. I love this caricature of the ladies terrifying themselves reading Gothic fiction. Gothic crime was sort of the thrillers, the whodunits of Jane Austen's day. They were hugely popular. Catherine Morland is certainly not alone in wanting to read about horrid crimes in Gothic fiction. Kidnapping of virtuous females, inhuman tyrants who lock up their wives or their daughters, spies, hidden wills, forged documents, all of these things come into Gothic fiction. Really, in many ways, the craze for Gothic novels was killed off by this man, Matthew Lewis, who wrote a book called The Monk. John Thorpe praises this book in Northanger Abbey, but not many other people praised it. It was so over the top, so horrid, so squalid, that it really sort of killed off the craze for Gothic novels almost overnight. So when Jane Austen is writing Northanger Abbey, she's doing so before The Monk became, started to sort of end the craze. But she's, I think she's poking fun at so many of the wonderful aspects of Gothic crime in fabulous Northanger Abbey. So the monk was 1796. So when Jane, finally, of course, Northanger Abbey gets published after her death, and she, um, sadly didn't get to see that book published in her own lifetime. But we don't quite know when she was revising the book, when the references to the monk got inserted into it. Now, prisons are an important part of sorry, I just thought somebody was coming into the room. Jails are another chapter in my book, and we know that Jane Austen visited a prison in Canterbury just a few years before she died, while she was busy working on Mansfield Park. And this is the prison that she visited. I wrote to them. I was able to find out detail about some of the prisoners, or what sort of number of people were there at the time of Jane Austen's visit. She went with her brother Edward because he was a magistrate. And it was an unusual visit for a woman to be making. To go and visit a prison was not something that every Regency lady tended to do. And I think she was very busy working on Mansfield Park at the time, and that is her novel that has the most prison imagery in it. And she handles prisons in a very interesting way in that book. So the locked gate at Southerton, one of the characters plays a jailer in Lover's Vows. She uses prison imagery, the starling, I cannot get out, the starling said. She uses prison imagery in very interesting ways in her novel Mansfield Park. So I tell you something about the old style of prison in Jane Austen's era, like old style, like Newgate, where every criminal was dumped in there together. Murderers were mixed in with thieves and pickpockets and highwaymen. There was no attempt to reform the prisoners in any way, and everyone was just lumped in together, and the conditions, of course, were truly horrific. But during Jane Austen's lifetime, there was an attempt to improve prisons and to create more separated, more separation for prisoners. So that's the old style of prison in the picture there, but you can see the new style. The picture up the top shows the prisoners in church on a Sunday, where every prisoner is sort of divided by a little barrier from the next one, and they're all in separate cells. And very little communication is allowed between the prisoners. If you've read Oscar Wilde's wonderful poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, that gives you a very clear idea of the separate system for prisoners that was still going on at that time. So we do hear about characters in prison. Sophia in Love and Friendship. Henry talks about being in prison in Lover's Vows in Mansfield Park. And Jane Austen, I think, uses the symbolism of prisons very cleverly within her fiction. And just very briefly to look at some of the, there's Maria at the locked gate. So the prison imagery coming through strongly there. Just to look briefly at punishments. This is one of the Holts. Jane Austen actually knew somebody who was a prison guard on one of the Holts. She mentions him in the letters. And this was because the jails had become so full that prisoners were dumped onto ships that were no longer being used by the Navy. And the conditions on the hulks were absolutely dreadful. If you've read Dickens's Great Expectations, you might remember that Magwitch escapes from one of the hulks at the start of that novel. And Jane Austen's seafaring brothers would all have been very aware of these prison ships that were in many of the ports in England. So it was a pretty ghastly situation. And eventually, of course, the hulks became so full, they started sending prisoners off to Australia in order to clear something of the problem. Hangings get mentioned in Sanditon. We hear about a man that is hanged in Sanditon, just a very brief mention. But hangings were very visible affairs. Punishment was not done behind the prison walls. The government felt that somebody who'd done something wrong needed to be visibly made a warning of to the rest of society. So hangings were popular entertainments. People would go along, the pickpockets would be there helping themselves to things, and they were very visible indeed. Many women and children watched them. Children, tragically, were also hanged. In Jane Austen's lifetime, a child of 8 was hanged for theft, which seems, of course, to us today, totally barbaric. But Georgians regarded that as, well, it happens. And, if you steal, that's what's going to be the consequence. So gibbets were at the roadsides, as I mentioned, with highwaymen. There's a highwayman looking at 2 hanging bodies, hopefully taking warning from their terrible fate. And Jane Austen makes quite a few references to hangings in her letters. She even talks about, I should be hanged if I do this or if I don't do that. So I list some of those references for you in my chapter on hangings. And there's one of the iron cages that were used at the roadsides so that the family could not come, take the body down and give it decent burial. So it was a gruesome sight, and they would sort of creak in the wind. And as I said, the birds would pick at them. It was a very vivid warning to people traveling around in Georgian England. There were many other interesting forms of punishment, like the stocks and the pillory. Jane Austen would almost definitely have seen people in these rather barbaric ways of punishing. It was in the year of her death that public flogging of women finally ceased. So Mr. Price in Mansfield Park talks about how he feels Maria Rushworth ought to be publicly flogged for her adultery. So he was one that would not have been in favour of public flogging being brought to an end. So all of these different crimes were very much, punishments, were very much a part of Jane Austen's society, and references to them certainly come into the novels. We hear in Pride and Prejudice that one of the officers got flogged, a corporal was flogged. Lydia Bennet reports on that. And Jane Austen would certainly have heard about punishments in the Navy from her brothers and been very aware of that as well. So a private was flogged, we hear in Pride and Prejudice. And lastly, just have a quick look at the men of the law. And some of Jane Austen's characters are involved very much in legal matters. A magistrate was appointed by the Crown. They could supply warrants. They could settle neighbourhood disputes. They could imprison beggars or gypsies. Mr. Knightley talks about trying to catch those gypsies in Emma. And they could appoint beadles. They could reward local constables. They had quite a list of different duties. So Mr. Knightley is a magistrate. Mr. Musgrove in Persuasion is also a magistrate. And of course, they had to attend trials. So we hear that Mr. Musgrove has to go travelling for the quarter sessions because he's involved in the trials. And they were often very unhealthy places because the men had come from prison. Jail fever was very common. So it was quite frequent that magistrates attending trials did pick up very nasty diseases and came home and died as a result. But we do have these men of the law. We also hear that in Pride and Prejudice that Mr. Darcy's, is it his great uncle, was a judge. Miss Bingley talks about that in Pride and Prejudice. And I think there we have an interesting play on the word judge, because Mr. Darcy is trying to judge Elizabeth Bennet. Miss Bingley is judging Elizabeth Bennet all wrong. And so this little play on Mr. Darcy's relative, who was a judge, makes us think about that word judge very carefully in that book. Trials tended to be very rapid events indeed. They could last for about half an hour sometimes. And if the judge and the jury were hungry and wanted to go off and have lunch, things would be brought to a close very quickly indeed. And that black cap could be put on and the poor prisoner could be pronounced guilty and taken off to be hanged. So there was not a lot of time spent on working out guilt or innocence. amongst the various characters. So there you can get another sense of a Georgian trial. Very rapid affairs, a lot of people not terribly well qualified, not very many character witnesses called in. They were pretty brutal affairs in Georgian England. So there I bring my talk to an end. The foreword to my book was written by a fabulous British crime writer, Reginald Hill. He was actually a speaker at the very first JASNA AGM that I ever attended, and he wrote a wonderful foreword to my book, Jane Austen and Crime. And his novel, A Cure for All Diseases, is his sort of updated Deal and Pascoe version of Jane Austen's Sanditon. So a very clever novel and well worth reading. So Jane Austen wrote that pictures of perfection make me sick and wicked. She did not really find perfection nearly as interesting as she found bad behavior. And I had a lot of fun producing my book, Jane Austen and Crime, showing just how she uses bad or criminal behavior in her fiction. As Jane mentioned when she introduced me, I produce a free monthly newsletter called Notes from a Book Addict. I give you lovely reading recommendations. I cover a fabulous poem every month. I celebrate literary anniversaries, and we're all looking forward to Jane Austen's 250th next year. It's going to be a big event around the world. And I just talk about all sorts of aspects of being a book addict. So you can sign up for this on my website. You can scan that. You can send me an email and I'll happily sign you up, whatever suits, but I would love to have you join me in receiving my monthly newsletter celebrating all things literary. So I do hope that you can join my newsletter, that you will check out my website and have a look at some of my literary tours. I love to have Americans join me. I'm doing a literary tour, sort of classic English writers in September, and I've got a lovely couple coming from the States to join me. And I really love having Americans join me on my tours. Don't forget that when you see the prices of the tours, they're in Australian dollars, so they're a lot less than American dollars. Just do a little conversion and find out. And I really would love it if you could join me on some of the fabulous tours that I've got planned over the next couple of years. So thank you all very much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed this little delving into Jane Austen's criminal world. And please think of coming to visit us at some stage at the Jane Austen Society of Australia. Jane has been recently. She loved her visit. We would really love to welcome you to this part of the world. Get in touch, come to a JASA meeting, and it's wonderful to share our love of Jane Austen with people all over the world. So thanks, everyone. And I'll just stop sharing my PowerPoint. And if people have got questions, feel free to turn on your pictures, your sound, and very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Susannah. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation, fascinating. Leah will now conduct the Q&A. So unmute yourself, Leah, and she's going to take the questions that were posted in the chat. Take it away, Leah.
Okay, so what I'll do is read off the questions. And the first question is, oops, here you go. Let me do that again. What would have happened to the gypsies and Emma?
Well, Mr. Knightley tries to find them, but we hear that they flee. In fact, one very interesting fact that I found out when researching for my book is that talking to gypsies was actually considered to be a crime. So when poor Harriet encounters those gypsies and begs them not to, press up against her and demand more money, she is actually committing a hanging offence by even speaking to them. Now, of course, any sensible magistrate would have realized that poor Harriet's in an awkward position and she's just trying to defend herself, and she is most unlikely to have been convicted. But it was considered to be a crime to have any conversation with a gypsy. So gypsies were quite frequently arrested. They were quite often hanged, but they became good at moving on very rapidly when they sensed any danger. And that, of course, is what happens in Emma. Whether they're still hanging around and they're the poultry thieves at the very end of the book, we can't be certain, but one guesses that, that is a possibility at the end of Emma. So the gypsy's fate would not have been a nice one.
Okay, next question. Was it common at the time for relatives to stay in the prison, particularly for young women?
Yes, it was quite common, and you get that, of course, in Charles Dickens with Little Dorrit, when the whole of the family moves into the prison with Mr. Dorrit. If you were arrested for debt, clearly you didn't have money to pay for a house and food and comfort for your wife and family. So they had very little choice often but to move into the prison with you. And yes, they could come and go, as happens in Dickens's novel. They were allowed to go out and do some shopping, maybe, and try and earn a bit of money. It seems to us a barbaric way of punishing a debtor, because you're dumping them in a prison where they have no way of earning any money to pay off the debts that have got them there in the first place. Surely it's much more sensible to allow somebody to continue working so that they can make money and pay the debts off. But it was quite a common thing for family to move into the prison as well. And conditions were really pretty atrocious.
Okay, next question. Did King George III chastise his sons for having mistresses? Could he do anything legal against the sons?
Well, he was horrified, because he does seem to have been a happily married man who did not have mistresses when he was married. And his wife didn't have affairs either. So he was fairly appalled by all these mistresses. I think his children, I forget the exact number, but they produced something like 40-something illegitimate children as a result of all the relationships with mistresses. And the king only had one legitimate grandchild, and that was Charlotte, the daughter of George IV, and she died in childbirth. So there were all these royal bastards that were, out there, and there was not a lot the king could do. He tried to, he complained about his sons. Various acts were brought in, like royal marriage acts, where, excuse me, a prince could not marry without his royal father's permission. But once he was married, there was really not much that could be done to stop a man having all the mistresses. So Claire Tomalin has written a wonderful book, Mrs. Jordan's Profession, about, excuse me, one of the Prince Regent's brothers who had an affair with Dora Jordan. And she gave him a large number of children. But finally, he ends up marrying somebody else. And poor Dora Jordan ends up with very, very little money at the end of her life. So that gives a very good picture of royal mistresses. So it was hard for the king to do much except complain bitterly about all of his sons.
All right, next. Would Willoughby have been in the Crim Crom trials for impregnating Colonel Brandon's ward, Eliza? Or is a ward not considered property because a ward is not a blood relative? Or was the duel considered an under-the-table activity?
Well, the ward, I guess, was considered property because he had an official position with regard to her. But Willoughby, at the time that he gets her pregnant, is not married. And she, now let me remember what, she's been married. The first Eliza has been married off, but this is Eliza, her daughter, who's not married. So neither Willoughby nor the young Eliza are married. So therefore, there couldn't be a crim con trial. You have to have an outraged husband there in order to have a crim con trial. So Willoughby's behavior is despicable in that he leaves a young girl pregnant without his address, no means of looking after herself. Colonel Brandon has to sort of step in and rescue her and provide a place where she can have her baby, and he'll continue to finance her. But Willoughby gets away without having to, no responsibility for that baby at all. And it's hard for him to imagine Willoughby later in his life thinking, oh gosh, I do have a bastard child out there somewhere. Maybe I'll go and see what that child is like and play the role of father. We can't see Willoughby really doing that, can we?
All right, the next question. I just learned that come upon the town was a euphemism for prostitution, merit in which Lydia would come upon the town for their own amusement. Are there any other slangs I've missed for prostitution or other crimes in Austen I've missed?
Well, yes, that come upon the town phrase, all the inhabitants of Meryton hope that Lydia Bennet will come upon the town and be a loose woman there. So it's a wonderful phrase. Gosh, there were a lot of euphemisms for prostitution and mistresses. There's a huge range of, different kept woman. They were sometimes also called Winchester geese, because in the old days, back in sort of Shakespeare's time, they were, sorry, was it Westminster geese? They were sent out of the main part of the city, and they had to wear a certain colour, so that it was very clear that they were prostitutes, and they had to wear these white aprons or something, I think it was. So they were referred to as geese. Which might also, reflect on the goose that's there in Hogarth's wonderful portrayal of the young lady about to become a prostitute. So yes, I mean, even today we have a lot of words, a harlot, a loose woman, lots of different words that get used. But I can't immediately think of another slang phrase like "come upon the town." Thank you for reminding me of that one.
All right, next question. I've heard that in England the phrase was guilty until proven innocent. Is this true?
Well, in Jane Austen's time, it pretty much was. If they nabbed you, that there was, especially if you were lower class, there was sort of an assumption that you were guilty. And as I said, trials could sometimes be as quick as 20 minutes. A magistrate could hold a little trial in a public room like the Crown Inn, and the unfortunate criminal would be dragged in front of him. Somebody would say, well, I saw him pinching my poultry. Okay, guilty, end of trial, and now you can be hanged. So it was all very quick. There was no real searching for evidence. Alexander Pope writes in his poem, The Rape of the Lock, that how unfortunate men will hang so jurymen may dine. So basically he's saying the jurymen want their lunch or their dinner. They want to wrap this up quickly. They're not going to waste any more time on that trial. Let's just bring it to a quick close, declare him guilty, and we can go off and enjoy our dinner. So that happened very frequently. They were pretty sham affairs. Mrs. Lee Perrott gets a lot more time in the courtroom, and character witnesses are called in, but then she was a gentlewoman. So it was, everyone was happy to give her more time, and there was almost an assumption, really, because she was an English gentlewoman, she must be innocent. Whereas if you were, a poor farmer or, a gypsy, certainly, the assumption really would be that you were guilty. So unless you could really prove total innocence with some reputable character witness, you had very little chance. Once you got into that courtroom, your fate was pretty much sealed.
Wow. All right. Next question. When it comes to humor and satire, I can't help but think of Dickens' Pickwick Papers, 1837. Would his treatment of crime or shady behavior characters be similar to Austen's?
Yes, there are many similarities, particularly in early Dickens, and the Pickwick Papers was his first published novel. Dickens was fascinated by crime. He had done some work as a lawyer. He gave up the law. He wasn't that interested. But of course, he has many legal issues and characters in his novels. Just think of Bleak House. He often attended trials. He attended a hanging. He was really interested in crime and its consequences, and that comes through very strongly in many of his novels. Men of the law like Mr. Jaggers, Mr. Vowles, there's so many of them. criminal activity, murder in his novels, lots of theft. So yes, he was a writer who was really intrigued by crime. And interestingly, one of his favorite activities when he went to Paris was going to visit the morgue. It's hard for us to imagine any sightseer going to Paris wanting to go and see dead bodies stretched out in the morgue. But Dickens loved it. He couldn't stay away. So he was, again, intrigued by the idea of these poor unfortunates that had washed up in the Seine or whatever it might be. He had a really strong interest in crime.
All right. Along those lines, the next question is, there is no direct correlation in Austen's literature, but it is in the background because of primogeniture and the naval connections. Do you have any information of the sodomy laws?
Well, that too is considered illegal. And we do have Mary Crawford's little joke about sodomy in Mansfield Park, which is a very interesting and unusual reference. And the idea of flogging in the Navy, you beat it out of them with the cat o' nine tails. But it's not something I go into in my book in any detail. But yet naval punishments and army punishments were very harsh. So when we hear about the private being flogged in Pride and Prejudice, again, it's just a passing reference. But you think, gosh, what did that private do? How many lashes of the whip did he get on his bare back? And Lydia Bennet just talks about it as if it's nothing. But there's some little dreadful human history there in that just that one line. The private was flogged. What did he do? What was he being flogged for? Who was watching? And Jane Austen's brothers in both the Navy and briefly with Henry in the army would have been very aware of the harsh discipline that was there in the armed forces in her lifetime.
Okay, and this one was the last question. What was the reasoning behind putting debtors in debtors' prison?
Well, it was felt you hadn't been able to pay your debts, you owed money, and therefore you should be punished for it. So they dumped them in these dreadful debtors' prisons or sponging houses, as we hear of in Sense and Sensibility. And as I said, it seems a very stupid way to deal with it because they can't earn any money at all. In Dickens's novel Little Dorrit, Mr. Dorrit has been years, I forget how many, 30 years in the prison, something like that. And he can't earn any money, but his daughter goes out and does work and makes enough money to bring food in to the prison because the food was terrible. You really needed some extra income to help make life the slightest bit bearable in the prison. So, men, of course, we see men in debt in Jane Austen's fiction, men like Willoughby, who does love Marianne, but not enough to marry her without any sort of fortune to go with her. He marries Miss Grey, who has a lot of money, but he has debts. We hear about his debts. Wickham certainly has debts in Pride and Prejudice. Tom Bertram has debts in Mansfield Park, but his father pays them off for him. But yes, it was just felt you had cheated somebody of what they owed and therefore pop you into prison. So doesn't seem sensible for us today, but there was not really anything about declaring a man bankrupt and giving him a chance to start over and try to pay off his creditors. That was still a bit early for that. So put them into prison was the answer.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions then.
Oh, thank you for many interesting questions, everybody.
Thank you very much, Susannah. Let's give her a big hand. And thank you to everyone for attending.
Thank you, Jane, for organizing, and lovely to see so many American Janeites joining today. Keep reading Jane Austen. Hope I'll meet many of you at JASNA AGMs or come to Australia. We'd love to welcome you. Thanks.
Thank you.